Today I'm going to be analysing An Encounter by Robert Frost. We'll start with what happens in this poem. A man is walking through a dense forest on a hot day. It's a really hard journey through the swamp and he wishes he'd stuck to the road that he knows. He rests and he looks up and sees a telephone pole. He talks to this pole and reflects on how technology is everywhere nowadays and it always has this grand plan for what it's doing. Then he tells us what his plan is. He doesn't have one. He's just wandering half-heartedly looking for the beauty of nature, but really he knows that it's lost and technology has taken over. I would describe this poem as pessimistic, regretful, hopeless, morose, things along those lines. Okay, so let's go through this poem line by line. Once, on the kind of day called weather breeder, when the heat slowly hazes and the sun by its own power seems to be undone. Weather breeder is a calm sunny day, supposed to prelude a storm, and here it signifies change. Hazes means clogging up the air, and the description of the sun undoing itself with its own power really portrays, first of all, how powerful nature is, but it's also interesting because it seems to display nature's power as temporary, because it's going to destroy itself. Also, the earlier description of the weather breeder has already set up this idea that today's weather is only temporary. I was half boring through, half climbing through a swamp of cedar. The repetition in line 4 represents the monotony of trudging through the swamp, and it also displays the rhythm of his steps. Boring has a double meaning. It means kind of drilling through, but it also has the sense of dull. A swamp of cedar is a really effective setting for this poem because it's such a vivid natural environment. It's enclosed, snug, dark, but really untamed and busy and towering above you. Choked with oil of cedar and scurf of plants, and weary and overheated, and sorry I ever left the road I knew. This again has the listing effect from the last couple of lines, and again it displays the monotony of his trip. There's also a real sense of unpleasantness in these lines. He's clearly complaining about the journey that he's on, and he wishes that he'd stuck to the road, which is the easier man-made passage, not the wild, untamed, natural one. We are really immersed in this sense of unpleasantness by the use of senses. In choked, that's a feeling and we can relate to that. Scurf is the scaly covering or skin of something, so that's got to be unpleasant as well. And overall, this is our first introduction to the theme of regret in this poem. The narrator wishes they hadn't gone this way, and now they're dealing with the consequences of their bad decision. I paused and rested on a sort of hook that had me by the coat as good as seated, and since there was no other way to looked up toward heaven, and there against the blue. So here the narrator is describing how their coat got stuck on a hook of a branch. Again, this goes with the theme of nature being powerful. Then he says there was no other way to look, which again displays the dense environment that he's in and sets the scene a little bit more. And the description in line 11 of against the blue is important as well, because the telephone pole, which we later learn is what he is looking at, is this sort of blot against the heavenly blue sky. So already we have negative connotations of whatever this thing is that he's looking at. Stood over me a resurrected tree, a tree that had been down and raised again, a barkless spectre. A spectre means any source of terror, and it's often associated with ghosts or phantoms. And this word, coupled with the word resurrected, means that we already have this sense of death. And we learn that this is a telephone pole from line 13. He had halted too, as if for fear of treading upon me. I saw the strange position of his hands. up at his shoulders, dragging yellow strands of wire with something in it from men to men. The most striking thing here is the personification of the telephone pole, and it has halted because it's frozen. And the narrator is suggesting that trees usually move, and they have this power because they could easily tread upon humans. But this tree is now tamed and under the command of humans. It's in this strange position, it's contorted and it's unnatural. And it's also dragging some wires, which is not a pleasant word. We don't have pleasant connotations when we think of dragging. "You here?" I said. "Where aren't you nowadays? And what's the news you carry, if you know? And tell me where you're off for. Montreal?" This is the first use of dialogue in this poem, and it's a really direct way of showing what's happening, which is a metaphor for the technological communication. That's really direct. The narrator seems surprised to find a telephone pole here, which is understandable given that a cedar swamp is basically like a jungle in less humid environments. He says to the telephone pole, "Where aren't you?" which is an adaptation of the normal phrase, "Where are you nowadays?" So it really gives an emphasis on the fact that technology is everywhere nowadays. There's also long fragmented sentences in this passage, and there's questions and they have short words, so there is a fast pace and kind of an urgency to it. And again, this is a metaphor for the technology, kind of the never-ending transfer of information and the urgency and kind of feverishness of it. Montreal is a city in Canada, which is obviously a long way away. The easy travel of technology displayed by this can be contrasted with his exhausting journey just through a little bit of woods, which we've been seeing throughout the rest of the poem. Me? I'm not off for anywhere at all. Sometimes I wander out of beaten ways, half looking for the orchid Calypso. So now the narrator is finally describing what they have been doing throughout the poem. They seem to be rebelling against technology and the fact that it always has a purpose and it's always going so fast-paced, because these lines have a really slow pace. They have mainly two-syllable words with alliteration of the soft syllable W. The narrator, unlike technology, does not have a purpose. He's just wandering. He has no direction. But then again, there's sort of a paradox because he says he's not off anywhere, yet he is half looking for the orchid Calypso. The fact that this is a paradox displays his uncertainty and his half-heartedness of even trying to find the flower. The orchid Calypso is an extremely rare but a beautiful flower. It's almost like this hidden gem of nature. At least that's what I think the metaphor is. But the narrator is only half looking for it because he doesn't really have any hope of finding it. And this serves as a summary of the theme going throughout the poem, which is that technology is overwhelming and maybe even destroying nature. It's a very anticlimactic end because everything led up to this. He's explaining what happened earlier in the poem, but he sounds really morose and regretful, and he could even be sighing as he's saying this. It's anything but a definitive end. It kind of isn't really saying anything or half-heartedly saying something, and I think that's the whole point. Okay, now let's move on to the narrator. The narrator is a person who is going through nature because they decided to go off the beaten track. They seem to be annoyed with technology taking over the world and taking over all the nature. They are quite regretful, hopeless, serene, resigned, and basically just pessimistic because they know they can't fight this thing that they don't want to happen. But they do try to rebel a little bit against nature being overwhelmed by just wandering, which contrasts with the telephone lines, which always have a destination. But still, they doubt that they will find the gem of nature that they're looking for, the real example of nature's beauty, and they're even giving in to the directness of technology because they wish they'd stayed on the path, the man-made and easier route. Now we're on to themes. There are 3 major themes in this poem for me. The first is change, the second is nature and technology, and the final one is hopelessness and regret. Firstly, the theme of change. This is instantly established in the poem by the mention of the weather breeder, which is a day of change in the weather, but the main change in this poem is the change from a nature-dominated world to a technology-dominated world. This is displayed through the man looking for the flower, but he won't find it, he knows, because technology is just taking over everywhere. So even the narrator, who does seem to want nature to be preserved, he doesn't want the change. Even he has lost his passion for nature in talking about it. He's only half-heartedly looking for his flower, and he also wishes that he'd stayed on the road. So the change seems inevitable. Nature and technology. The underlying message in this poem is the fear that people will stop appreciating nature and just value technology. So the power of nature is explored quite a lot. The sun outdoes itself with its own power. A tree could tread on a person. There's this personification of nature, so it appears intelligent like a human. There's the hook of the branch which traps the narrator, and there's the choking oil of the cedar trees. There's also the gem of the orchid Calypso. But at the same time, this power is sort of diminished in the poem because the narrator has no hope of finding the orchid Calypso. And even in the really rich natural environment of the cedar swamp, there's a telephone pole there. So even though nature is seen as this really powerful force full of life, technology is kind of seen as the superior force because it's likened to death, and death always defeats life in the end. It also has a negative connotation because it is likened to death. We don't like death. The tree has been personified, so we kind of feel sympathy for the tree because it's been mutilated and killed and then put back up as a telephone pole. Also, the telephone pole blocks out heaven, so it's almost like this blot against the purity that is nature. The directness of technology and the ease of use is represented in the dialogue used in this poem. There's an urgency and a feverishness in the repeated questions and the run-on sentences and the fragmented nature of the narrator talking to the technology. There's just overall a fast pace to that part of the dialogue, contrasted with his lack of direction and his wandering and his kind of slow regret when he's describing him being amongst nature. Lastly, there's the theme of regret and hopelessness in this poem. So the narrator clearly doesn't like that technology is taking over nature because he's annoyed at the telephone pole being there, and he describes it like this horrible dead thing. But when he tries to rebel from always having a destination and the fast pace by wandering through nature, he fails because he comes across the telephone pole just when he's trying to look up at the sky, and he himself is affected by the convenience and just the easier use of technology. He wishes he'd actually taken the road, and he just seems wearied of wandering through nature by the end of the poem. So the change that he doesn't like is displayed as this inevitable force which he won't be able to change and is affecting him too. So it's definitely a sense of pessimism for the individual. I'm going to wrap this up with my personal highlights from the poem. So I really like how technology is displayed as bad. Just the way that that's done is really clever. The way that it's blocking out heaven is a really visual way of representing it, and then the metaphor of death enlists a lot of our connotations to help with the meaning that Frost is trying to get across. Then there's the personification of the tree, which I really like, which definitely for me makes me feel sympathy for the tree and just feel like, oh, that's such a shame that it was stripped down and became a telephone pole. Then there's the theme of change, which I just think is really cool. Especially how the narrator himself, who is resisting the change, is beginning to favour man-made things over natural things. So there's this real sense of uncertainty for the narrator, and I think just this sense of being alone because he has no idea what the right thing is, or if he does, then he finds himself favouring the wrong side, and he doesn't know how to deal with that, and I think that's a really kind of complex internal issue. Then there's the setting. I think the cedar forest is such an effective setting because it really does get across the vividness of nature and how it's full of life. If you just look up pictures of cedar swamps, you get some really cool pictures, and I especially like how this is displayed through the line. And since there was no other way to looked up toward heaven, because that really shows how dense this environment is. You can't look anywhere except up if you want to see something that isn't this mad rush of colours and textures. Then it has a telephone pole in, which really displays how technology is taking over nature, even in the richest places. And I can actually imagine that because I think we have places like cedar swamps here in Britain where I live, and you do still see telephone poles there, and so that just really worked for me to get across this message. And finally, I really like the anticlimax at the end of the poem. I'm quite a fan of anticlimaxes to get across effects, and I think this really worked to display the narrator's hopelessness and just how resigned he was. He's just like, oh yeah, me, I'm just half looking for this flower, and he sounds really depressed. And yeah, I just think that was really well done. So that was An Encounter by Robert Frost.